Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm joined today by, I'm proud to say, the newest member of the A Fork in Time and Room Where It Happened team. That's Dylan Holzemer. Dylan has been on a couple of episodes with us, and we liked him so much and thought that he brought so much to the table that we didn't make him wait the normal waiting period. He's going to Cooperstown without having to wait 5 years, is what one of my colleagues said to me. So, Dylan, I'm excited about you joining the team, the perspectives that you bring, and so, hey, thanks for being on with me today. Thanks for joining the team. And as I mentioned to you, we were setting this up. I thought a good thing to do, we had a chance to visit off podcast a good bit around some of our recordings and just let our listeners know who you are a little bit more, get introduced to you so that when they hear you, you're not just a voice bringing insight, but they know a little bit about your background and who you are, and they can put the bigger picture together. So, Dylan, welcome formally to the team and welcome to our episode today.
Thank you, Don. It's an honor. It's a pleasure to be expedited, I guess is the word. I feel like I've been fast-tracked. I'm important. I feel like a politician.
Yeah, but by the way, and you didn't have to do what you normally have to have happen. You know, with my thinking about that with MLB, you normally have to die for them to skip the 5-year waiting period. So you're alive and you get to do it even better.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. It's just an honor. First off, I want to thank you for getting me through basically a year and a half, 2 years of the pandemic, listening basically continuously to the back catalog. So that was really kind of where I started. Between that and Harry Turtledove, a lot of how everybody else kind of gets into alternate history. But you guys got me through a solid 2 years of desk work in the pandemic and kept things entertaining. So I want to thank you and the rest of the team for doing what you guys do for everybody out there and making things a little more bearable.
I appreciate that, Dylan. And as I've said multiple times on the podcast, the great benefit that I didn't think we would derive when Alexis and I had talked about it, and then I finally just thrust it upon her and started it. And it's like, okay, now we've done this. Now we're committed to it. There in 2019, as I had no idea what was looming 9 months down the road and how that was going to change things. And to hear your story, actually touches me a little bit to know that we were there and doing something positive beyond just doing what we love to do and have fun and talk, but also doing the podcast during that period of time brought a level of sanity to me too, because I was working from home and not interacting with the world a lot. And so even though it's a one-way medium, in so many ways, I felt like, okay, at least I'm doing something different here. This is a nice distraction. And I would get the feedback from, folks that we were meeting or for episode feedback, whatever it was. Okay, people are listening. So this is worth doing. And it was a odd one-way dialogue connection to the real world, if that made any sense as we were going through that. And so I sort of feel the same way. Everybody knew it was coming and that we would all need that.
Yeah, it's you saved me from I know the feeling of talking to oneself, because I was for this is kind of a long story short, but I was basically in charge of running an entire department at work as a department of one. So I became a little more comfortable talking to myself than most people probably should be, just to pass the time. So being able to know that somebody else knows the feeling is it's a nice change.
Yeah, cool. So I appreciate those kind words, and I appreciate how we got connected and you being active and engaged in episode. So you decide what to share here. Tell folks a little bit about your background, what you do during the day. I know that's as you described yourself, you're a dirt attorney, is how you described it to me once. So I know it's real estate law, but what else? And of course I know you have some interesting sort of hobbies and side things that we sort of brought to the Elvis episode and some of the other things there. So just, if you're going to give the elevator speech and assume you're going up to a really tall building like in Abu Dhabi, what would you tell people about Dylan?
So let's see here. Born and raised Memphian. I'm the son of two teachers. My dad was a high school history and English teacher for 35 years. So that kind of started the interest in history and sort of the possibilities of history and things like that, he was very much sort of in the veins of the American West, military history, because he had been drafted and his dad was in the Navy in World War II. I kind of came in and went to college and originally thought I was going to be a teacher and decided to get a history degree because, well, I was already good at it. I didn't have to study. I basically didn't have to go to class, and I could write most of my papers about 3 hours before they were due the night before, as one does in college. So it seemed like the perfect fit. I ended up in college going more kind of towards the classics. I know from some of our back and forth, we've tossed some ideas about I tend to be more of the ancient and sort of medieval period, although I do like a lot of the kind of American West sort of area in the 1800s. But I quickly realized I had enough teachers in my family. There's my parents, and then one of my aunts are also a teacher. So we were getting recognized enough at grocery stores and various places around town for that. I figured the family needed a little bit of variety. So I decided I was lucky enough to be able to get into law school, went to do that. Originally, while I was in college and actually in law school, I decided to be a tour guide. So I actually was down on Beale Street giving people tours and things like that. It was the perfect college gig, and I got to talk a lot about Memphis history, which is sort of what led me to knowing a lot about Elvis when we did the Graceland episode. And then in law school, it was perfect because I could study, I could learn about torts and contracts and real estate, and then go play guitar and give a tour for 2-3 hours and then come right back. It was basically stress relief that I got paid for, which was the most wonderful way to get through law school. But that's kind of how I started. And originally, I actually wanted to be an entertainment lawyer because of the sort of musical connection and things like that. You can't see it, but I've got an amp and a rack of 4 or 5 guitars in the back. It's getting excessive. But then long story short, I kind of stumbled into real estate. I did closings for a year or so, just kind of the first job that I took after law school. You just sort of, for any lawyers who are listening, you know full well, you become an expert in whatever people will hire you to do, not necessarily what you want. And then I was lucky enough to stumble into the current job that I have, which, as one attorney explained to me, when I told him basically what I do, he said, I didn't know that was such a thing, but now I kind of want that job. So the short version of what I do now is I am a non-practicing real estate attorney who works in the courthouse. The county does delinquent property tax foreclosures when people don't pay their property taxes. Obviously, especially in a state like Tennessee, those of you who understand sort of the economic demographics of sort of the U.S. and the various states, Tennessee is a very property tax heavy state. Most of our revenues from that, especially on the county level. And there are quite a bit of properties in Shelby County, not to get too much into it, but because of the socioeconomic status of the city, there are unfortunately a lot of people who are delinquent on taxes. And so I help the county do that stuff to sort of recoup property tax revenue. So basically, I am a non-practicing dirt lawyer who works in the courthouse because I figured the best way to avoid going to court was to work there.
There you go. you can walk by it, but you don't have to actually go in it. That makes
exactly.
Yeah, I've told my backstory a lot of times on the podcast and to others. I at one point was going to go to law school, was smart enough to work for an attorney when I was an undergraduate. Although, depending on, again, like you said, whatever you may have worked on, may have had a different interest. But I quickly realized I don't want to do this while I'm too far along with a political science degree. So what am I going to do? So, it makes perfect sense that I sell things for a living and talk for a living. But it's like you said, I enjoy what I do. I've enjoyed what I've learned over now 30 years of doing consultative selling. And it's interesting to me, like a lot of degrees, be it history or be it political science, quote unquote liberal arts types of degrees are a good basis for almost anything you do. I think I would encourage more people to get a more generalized education, and then obviously get the education you need to be specialized in whatever you're doing, because that general education will pay off for you at some point, whether you even realize how it's going to be there or not. So you mentioned your love of history. You told me a great story. We may have talked about this on air. I don't want to hear it again. Your family had a brush with greatness with one of my favorite historians. That would be Civil War historian Shelby Foote.
Yes. So Shelby Foote, for those of you who may not know, especially some of the international listeners, Shelby Foote was this sort of historic, sort of once in a generation historian in terms of how important this one series of books that he did became. He is the guy who did the Civil War, a narrative, this sort of magnum opus 3-part series of the history of the Civil War done in kind of a narrative style. It was hugely influential on, Ken Burns. I think it was the most cited thing for his Civil War documentary by, above and beyond everything else. Shelby Foote's just this seminal historian of sort of the American Civil War period. He lived in Memphis the whole time he was writing those books, and Memphis was his home base when he was doing that. And my dad, among other things that he did, he would coach high school soccer. So he would take his soccer kids out to Overton Park, which is this big park in the center of the city that's actually got its own historical kind of importance. It's Supreme Court precedent. I don't want to get too lawyerly nerdy, but that's a whole nother fun story. But basically, it's this big, beautiful park in the center of the city, and he would go have his kids play soccer there. And he would periodically see, my dad being a history teacher, he knew who Shelby Foote was. He would see Shelby Foote sitting on a park bench, just sitting there daydreaming while he was, working on something or other, a manuscript, thinking about what he was going to write. And so one day he's got his kids playing soccer in this big greensward area. It's this big open field. And Shelby Foote just starts walking. He goes straight from his park bench. He's off daydreaming. He's not looking where he's going. He's just wandering straight through this soccer practice. My dad's trying to wave kids so that they don't hit him in the freaking head with a soccer ball. And he just wanders through. He's not paying attention. He just kind of keeps going, and he just sits down on another park bench. And that was that.
What just flashed through my head, Dylan, was the headline that could have been, renowned Civil War historian Shelby Foote died today as a result of a soccer ball hitting him in the head in Memphis, film at 11 kind of thing. That would have been a whole different story.
Oh yeah. No, that could have been bad, but no, fortunately no soccer balls. We were safe. Shelby Foote went on to publish all of his good stuff. Yeah. So it's, one of the things that I like particularly about living in Memphis and a lot of, other sort of medium-sized cities like that is you kind of have all these connections that sort of tie people together. You'll hear stories around here of people of a certain age sitting at a red light and running into Elvis in a Cadillac, pulling up right next to him and just chit-chatting through the window in the 70s as they're just driving around town. So it's just kind of one of those things. It's interesting to see how, the connections between people can sort of pop up where you don't expect.
Yeah. And it's easy to see where you got your love of history from. Obviously, it's somewhat genetic. It's also somewhat the setting and the surroundings that are there. And one of the things we've talked about, we talk about a lot of things and eventually get around to doing them is, one of the things we want to go more frequently with A Fork in Time and the room where it happened is further back into that period that you like, further back into history. It's easy to get trapped in the Alexis has an idea about something in, British history, which goes back for a while, but doesn't go back to the other way, or for us to get trapped in a lot of things that are a little bit more, modern for our listeners. But one of the things we've talked about is, a room where it happened, where the room might be where the Senate met at a couple of different places when it was the Roman Senate, and then, working off some of the things that go there, because I do find that era of history fascinating. And that era of history is so influential on Western culture and what we are today, be it law, be it politics, be it thought, whatever the case might be. So I know we've talked about that. We'll eventually get around to doing it as we're rolling forward here. So I want to talk a little bit about the musical thing there. So you play, obviously, and you may have mentioned this earlier. Was that a family thing as well, or did you pick that up separately?
Yes. Yeah, that was a family thing. My dad picked it up when he was in college. And so I kind of always had guitars around the house. I used to when I was a kid, just sort of, kind of how little kids do. They sort of bang on everything to figure out what sounds good and what doesn't. So I would just kind of whack the guitar strings, just making noise really. But, eventually I kind of picked it up from watching him do it. It came in handy because at the tour company that I worked at, we would actually do musical tours where you would actually play the songs of Memphis as you were driving around. We had this whole rigged up bus with a mic and a PA system, and you would actually play, Stax tunes, Otis Redding, Elvis, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee, as we were driving around pointing to all this stuff. So it was really kind of a fun thing. And then it turned into just sort of a good way to kind of relieve stress, get a creative outlet, get away from, the studying and the stress of work and having to do that. And actually I still play in a band with my dad and some of his college buddies. We have a blues band. We play not super frequently. A lot of them are getting on in years, because they were in college in the late 60s and early 70s, but just it's a good way for us to get together and just sort of have fun and play.
Yeah, and it's a fun thing to share across generations, I'm sure as
Yeah.
well. I'm sure you have that with your dad. How many times you and your dad probably talk history stuff is probably more than you
Oh
can
yeah.
count, and probably still do. But it's nice to have a different topic to go to outside of that as well.
Yeah.
And music is history. That's to me that's one of the interesting things you were talking about, the Ken Burns Civil War documentary, which I still hold up there as being one of the best that's ever been made, particularly if you like the topic that's being there. But one of the things that he welded and melded through there were the interviews with folks like Shelby Foote, where he became a public superstar. He was already
Yeah.
a superstar in the history, but just because of his ability to tell a story, he's a great narrator of stories and making them relevant. But one of the things that Burns did inside of that was incorporate musical motifs in such a way that they became like opera or modern musical. Certain motifs sort of represented certain things, and you didn't even realize that that was being done in your head while it was being done to you. That's how skillfully done it was. And so I appreciate that as well. So again, Dylan, I am real excited about having you on the podcast on a regular basis. I know the other members of the team are. There was discussion behind the scenes about how you may offset the balance of power on the Great Barbecue debate, but that's okay. We will eventually. About the time that you get peace in the Middle East, we will solve the Great Barbecue. We will solve the Great Barbecue dilemma, because they have about the same level of at least complexity, if not the same level of importance, when it comes to trying to get them solved. But there was concern among some of the quote unquote Texas faction about letting in another out of state person with a different take on barbecue. But that will pop up, I'm sure, from time to time. But Chris and Eric and Robert and others will make sure that it pops up from time to time, because that's one of the things they like to talk about. We spend a lot of time off podcast. I'll just say this: we spend a lot of time off podcast talking about that. Probably more than I ever imagined that we would. I never thought I would have to defend Texas brisket as often as I do to what my daughter was referred to. Those you mean those foreigners that you have to defend Texas brisket to, is how she once described it on the side. So I get it. The other thing I thought we'd just do here really quick, because it ties back to the first episode you joined us for, and it's also a current event. We were exchanging some messages, some text messaging back and forth, getting this set up, just about Lisa Marie Presley's sort of sudden, untimely death. And I'm just going to ask you here, this is a different form of the what if, but at least we get a what if into this so that we can officially call it an episode. Is that, what does this potentially mean? I maybe not so much for in a big sense, but Graceland is a big part of the Memphis economy, right?
Yeah. So Graceland is still, to this day, the number 2 visited house in the country, second only to the White House. It is one of the most visited tourist attractions of any kind. And it's interesting because, most houses that you go visit for a historical sense, they're just like, they're a time capsule of their time and place, but they're like frozen in time. Whereas Graceland, especially with all the stuff they've done to it, is really not that. It is a whole holistic experience of sort of the evolution of a whole period of music, and not just sort of, oh yeah, here's these 3 years where Elvis liked to have plants in a room. I'm talking about the Jungle Room, where he just went on the Hawaiian theme. That's tacky in the sense of, this was a stylistic choice from this very specific period in the mid 60s. But it becomes more of a motif that really ends up sort of standing in for a lot of Memphis. It is probably, tourism is by far second, maybe only to logistics. They're kind of neck and neck.
Right.
Memphis is primarily funded by 2 things: logistics, obviously, because we've got FedEx, and tourism, from Beale Street, from everything else, but especially for Graceland. And in terms of the legal aspects of who's going to end up owning Graceland, we can get into that. That's really going to stay in the family. But in terms of the financial aspects of what's going to happen now, honestly, I think that's going to be kind of the reckoning that's going to happen. I don't think much is going to change in terms of the sort of tourist experience of Graceland, because all of that is run by Elvis Presley Enterprises, which is a separate legal entity. They spun the business aspect off of it years ago. And although I think Lisa Marie and Priscilla I think Priscilla still has a seat on the board of Elvis Presley Enterprises, and Lisa Marie, I think, did up until her death. They weren't involved in the day-to-day decision making. They haven't been for probably 10 or 15 years now. So Graceland as a business entity is going to stay the way it is, but I think Memphis is going to have to. I've thought this for years, but I think especially now, Memphis is going to have to find a way to, as much as I hate to say it, wean itself off of its Elvis dependency.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too. How this impacts that. Yeah.
Yeah, because Graceland is kind of this, monolithic sort of tourist presence in Memphis. I think I joked about it when we went either before the podcast or when we were talking on the Elvis episode we did. Graceland for people in Memphis is like the place where you take your relatives when they're in town for Thanksgiving. That's basically what it is. But it's such a huge pivotal part of our economy because, you travel anywhere in the world. I've been to the UK, I've been to Spain, I've been to Italy. I've talked to people from all over the world. And the first thing you say when you say, "Oh, I'm from Memphis," is they say Elvis and they say barbecue. That's it. You're only known for two things. God help you for anything else. You're only known for two things if you come from Memphis. And so it's this thing that has sort of gotten a life of its own, but that life you can kind of see has an expiration date.
Yeah.
That isn't known, but you can sort of see that it's coming. Because obviously the original fans of Elvis, just based on pure mathematics because of the time, they're already getting to the point where they can't really travel. So Graceland is going to start really very quickly running out of its primary financial system of support, and it's going to have to be relying on sort of second generation and independently created kind of rockabilly fans, people who discover Elvis but weren't around with Elvis. There's communities in like Scandinavia and Japan that have sort of these thriving. It's really kind of fascinating if you've never seen them in big groups. There's these whole rockabilly, communities of people that will come, and you'll be looking at a bunch of Swedish people, tall, skinny, blonde people with these big 4 or 5 inch pompadours and, pink shirts and fancy shoes. And they're just walking around and you're like, did I time travel or something? But that's going to be what Graceland ends up having to rely on, unless they can start figuring out some other way to do it. It's hard to monetize a fixed location,
right,
in an evolving way where you can sort of reinvent the place. Graceland's been showing off things that had already been decades old for decades now. So it's going to be interesting. I feel bad for the city in terms of what it's going to have to go through, I think, to finally find something else to be known for other than Elvis. I think, quite frankly, we've been relying on it for too long. It's become kind of our crutch.
Yeah. And it's time to diversify the whole Bill Street music experience, all the other things that are historically great about Memphis, not just things that you would create moving forward, but covering it both ways.
Yeah,
makes perfect sense to me. I was just curious to get your take on it, because again, when I heard the news, which was sort of shocking, and part of the reason I connect there, I think I mentioned this I know I did on the episode, my parents, I grew up listening to Elvis because, they listened to Elvis and the things that were there, and, the generation and the timing that I'm in, I'm below that generation you described, but I was the kids of the generation that you described there, obviously. But, Lisa Marie, pretty close to me in age. So there's, when you see somebody that's about your age who, passes away suddenly, and, the stuff that had gone through there with, the loss of a son. And we know some of, the addiction issues, which echo back to the things that we talked about while we don't enjoy we don't have new Elvis music today, because he's gone too soon, is, I started thinking through, what does this mean? Because I went to Graceland as a fairly young adult, actually on a trip that I took with my parents right after my dad retired. The whole family went. They wanted to go to Nashville, and Memphis was on the way, and we definitely were going to hit Graceland on the way to Nashville. And I toured Graceland, and what you described there, I'd heard about the Jungle Room, to be in the Jungle Room. The house, in some ways, as you said, has evolved because there's the museum and the other things that they've done that are around it. It's a destination, but parts of the house at the time, I think his aunt was still living upstairs. And so the
family still celebrates Christmas every year at Graceland.
Yeah.
Those
so,
people who are left.
Sort of this weird thing. And, I was thinking, when you mentioned the Jungle Room, I was thinking about Mark Cohn's song, which makes a reference to it. And that's all you have to say is the Jungle Room. And anybody of a certain age and a certain thing knows what you're talking about. I mean, it's, it's, and by the way, I think it was tacky even when it was current, but that's okay. That was the nature of that.
Yeah. The tackiness was the point at that point. It had become sort of its own stylistic thing.
Yeah. So, I agree with you. I think it's going to be an interesting thing to see. And this is not just a challenge. You mentioned, I live in the Houston area. For the longest period of time, people would come. We'd take them to NASA. That was the logical thing to do, right? I mean, it's here. So, or, for a period of time, find something to do where they may be able to go see something in the Astrodome when that was still a thing, when we cover stadiums all the time now, but that was the first time we did it and did it the way we did it in style. So I am going to be watching that because I understand, the economic impact of that. And to the point that you've already made, there's a rich heritage of music and other things that are there in Memphis that are, Elvis is just a part of that. If you really understand the blues and you really understand some other things about, reasons to go, there's reasons to go other than a converted church that somebody made into a mansion.
Yeah, so, that's a good way of putting it. I think if I could, because actually while we were talking is what I wish Graceland would become, I don't think there's any way that it's going to, at least for the time being. I would love it to be kind of like, almost like the Ryman is in Nashville, or the Grand Ole Opry, where it's, because they have a concert venue there already, but where it's turned into sort of a place to celebrate all of Memphis music, using the backdrop of Elvis as sort of the natural, location and sort of binding thread of the blues, country, rock and roll, gospel, all of that, but sort of turned it into a more broad-based, performance venue and sort of expression of Memphis music, not just, oh, this is all about Elvis. I think they're going to have to do something like that in order to continue.
I think that's a cool idea. And another thing that popped into my head, just realizing here, there's going to be the Elvis bump. I think that's already come here from like the Golden Globe win. One of the last things you saw, there's a public appearance, was because of the Elvis movie. And so they're going to be, there's Elvis. We're in that Elvis, another boost of nostalgia phase here. This is an event, a tragic event, is still going to nudge that along a little bit. But to the point, 5-10 years from now, what nudges people to say, let's, again, my parents, we were going to Nashville, we were going to stop in Memphis and time that trip out in such a way we had time to do Graceland. That was part of the itinerary, and that was actually 30 years ago, give or take now, so that was going to be done. And so I know that was part of it. Again, Dylan, I just want to say again how excited we are to have you join the team, and looking forward to. I know you've already made some topical suggestions. We're going to get some things done there, and it's nice to have our in-house, as we discovered as we were doing some of the Eisenhower and some of the other episodes. It's actually a good thing to have somebody with some legal training who's a lawyer on the podcast, because I think you're one of the lawyers that Shakespeare wouldn't have wanted to kill, Dylan. It's just as simple as that.
I think that might be the most complimentary thing anybody's ever said about my legal career. There
you go. Anything else you want to say to me or say to the good folks?
No, I just want to say to everybody who's a frequent listener, forgive me for any terrible jokes that I may tell from now until Kingdom Come, and to everybody who's on the team, and thanks for having me on. I look forward to being able to help out and have some fun.
Sounds good. Dylan, have a great rest of your day. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us. And we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.